The sea had finally grown quiet. For days, a Viking longship had fought its way through towering waves and relentless winds somewhere in the North Atlantic. Every sailor on board understood the dangers that surrounded them. A violent storm could smash a ship against hidden rocks. Freezing water could claim lives within moments. A single navigational mistake might leave an entire crew stranded hundreds of miles from home. But as the clouds slowly cleared and the voyage continued, another concern began to outweigh everything else. The greatest threat was no longer outside the ship. It was resting inside a collection of wooden barrels beneath the deck. Those barrels held the one resource every expedition depended upon. Without it, no crew could survive, no matter how skilled the sailors or how strong the vessel. They contained fresh water. Today, it is easy to overlook just how valuable clean drinking water once was. Modern technology allows us to turn a tap and trust what flows from it. The Vikings had no such luxury. Every river, every stream, every spring, and every barrel carried uncertainty. Water that looked perfectly clear could still bring sickness, weaken an entire crew, or destroy months of careful planning before an enemy was ever encountered. Unlike us, the Vikings had no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or microscopic parasites. They could not examine a water source or perform any kind of scientific test. Instead, they depended on something built over countless generations: observation. Families remembered which springs remained reliable year after year. Farmers learned which streams stayed clean after heavy rain and which became unsafe. Sailors shared practical knowledge gathered during long voyages, passing it from experienced crews to younger generations. Every success and every mistake gradually became part of a growing body of knowledge that no one had written down, yet everyone respected. This quiet wisdom shaped nearly every aspect of Viking life. It influenced where people built farms, where new settlements appeared, and even which routes travelers chose across unfamiliar landscapes. Before fertile land, rich forests, or sheltered harbors could matter, one question always came first: could people trust the water? Without a dependable answer, no community could survive for long. Long before the Vikings became famous for crossing oceans, discovering distant lands, or launching raids across Europe, they had already solved one of the oldest challenges every civilization has faced. They learned that survival often depended not on finding water, but on knowing which water could safely be trusted. For the Vikings, the search for safe drinking water always began before the first house was built and long before a ship was launched. When settlers arrived in a new region, they looked for fertile land and protected anchorages, but neither of those mattered if fresh water could not be found nearby. A prosperous settlement depended on a reliable supply of clean water every single day. Without it, crops failed, livestock suffered, and disease could spread through an entire community. Experience taught the Scandinavians where to search. Whenever possible, they preferred cold springs emerging from underground. Unlike ponds or shallow pools, spring water remained naturally filtered as it passed through layers of rock and soil. Fast-moving streams flowing down from the mountains were also highly valued because constant movement helped keep the water cleaner than stagnant sources. These natural advantages allowed many rural farms to avoid the serious health problems that plagued larger settlements. Their understanding of water influenced far more than daily life. It shaped the expansion of the Viking world itself. As Norse settlers established new communities beyond Scandinavia, they carefully selected locations where dependable freshwater sources already existed. One well-known example comes from Ireland, where Viking settlers continued moving inland along the River Lee until they reached an area supplied by abundant natural springs. Those same springs remained important centuries later, eventually becoming famous as holy wells and continuing to provide clean water for the communities that grew around them. Travel followed the same logic. Long journeys across unfamiliar landscapes were planned around dependable water sources rather than simple distance alone. Travelers understood exactly where they could refill their containers before continuing onward. Even the Old Norse unit, known as a rost, reflected this practical way of thinking, describing the distance between natural stopping points where fresh water could be found. For isolated farms surrounded by forests, rivers, and open land, these methods worked remarkably well. Small populations placed relatively little pressure on the environment, allowing many natural water sources to remain clean for generations. Success, however, created an unexpected problem. As trade expanded and settlements developed into busy towns, thousands of people began sharing the same limited water supplies. Workshops produced waste, animals occupied crowded streets. Everyday life generated pollution on a scale that earlier farming communities had never experienced. Water that had once sustained growing settlements was slowly becoming part of a much larger challenge. Finding clean water was no longer enough. The Vikings now had to discover how to protect it. As Viking settlements grew into thriving centers of trade, a new problem emerged that no amount of experience could completely prevent. The same prosperity that attracted merchants, craftsmen, and travelers also placed increasing pressure on the very resource every community depended upon. More people meant more animals, more workshops, more waste, and far greater demands on local water supplies. A stream that had easily supported a small farming settlement could quickly become unreliable once an entire town grew around it. Some of the Viking world's greatest trading centers faced exactly this challenge. Places such as Jorvik, Dublin, and Hythabu bustled with commercial activity throughout the year. Ships arrived carrying goods from across Europe. Blacksmiths worked their forges. Leather workshops processed hides. Markets filled with merchants speaking different languages. These towns became symbols of Viking success. Yet beneath their busy streets, another story was unfolding. Keeping water clean became increasingly difficult. Rain washed waste through crowded neighborhoods. Animal pens stood close to homes. Everyday refuse accumulated wherever space allowed. Over time, pollutants seeped into the surrounding soil, threatening wells and shallow groundwater. Water that appeared perfectly safe could quietly carry the risk of disease. Modern archaeology has revealed just how serious these conditions became. Excavations in Viking towns have uncovered evidence of widespread intestinal parasites, confirming that contaminated water remained a constant danger for many urban communities. The Vikings could not see the organisms causing these illnesses, but they understood the practical consequences. Certain water sources repeatedly made people sick, while others proved far more dependable. Rather than accepting the problem, they searched for practical solutions. In Hythabu, deep wells were carefully constructed using recycled wooden barrel staves reinforced with tightly packed clay. This simple but effective design helped protect the shaft from contaminated surface water while drawing cleaner groundwater from deeper layers below. In Dublin, engineers created sophisticated drainage systems, protected wells, and rainwater collection structures that reduced the amount of polluted runoff reaching valuable freshwater supplies. None of these innovations required scientific theory. They were the result of careful observation repeated across generations. People remembered which methods worked. Builders improved successful designs. Communities adopted techniques that consistently produced cleaner water. Little by little, practical experience became a form of engineering. This side of Viking society rarely receives the attention it deserves. Popular history celebrates warriors crossing oceans and raiding distant kingdoms. Yet those achievements depended just as much on ordinary craftsmen, builders, and farmers solving everyday problems at home. Without reliable water, thriving towns could not exist. Without thriving towns, long-distance trade would have struggled to grow. And without both, the Viking world would have looked very different. But despite all these improvements, one challenge still remained. Sometimes even the cleanest well was not the safest thing to drink. To modern readers, one aspect of Viking daily life often comes as a surprise. Many Scandinavians did not rely on plain water as their primary drink. This was not because they preferred alcohol. It was because they trusted experience. Over generations, they discovered that certain fermented drinks often remain safer to consume than untreated water taken from crowded settlements. Without understanding bacteria or disease, they simply observed the results. Families that relied on these drinks became less vulnerable to many of the problems associated with contaminated water, and those practical habits were passed from one generation to the next. One of the most common beverages was a lightly fermented drink known today as small beer. Unlike the strong ales served during celebrations, this was an everyday drink produced from a weaker mash after the main brewing process. Because the water had been heated during brewing before fermentation began, the finished drink was often more reliable than water collected from questionable sources. It contained very little alcohol, making it suitable for regular consumption while providing an additional layer of protection that raw water could not always offer. Brewing, therefore, became more than a way to produce alcohol. It became part of everyday survival. In most households, the responsibility for brewing belonged to women, whose knowledge was essential to family life. Each batch represented centuries of practical experience rather than scientific understanding. The Vikings could not explain why the process worked so well, but they knew from observation that it consistently produced dependable results. Not every fermented drink served the same purpose. Mead, produced from fermented honey, occupied a special place in Viking culture and was closely associated with feasts, ceremonies, and religious traditions. Strong ales were reserved for important gatherings and celebrations. These drinks reflected status and community, while weaker fermented beverages quietly supported everyday life throughout the year. In the harsher environments of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, another remarkable solution emerged. Instead of relying entirely on beer, many communities produced a fermented whey drink known as blanda. Made from the liquid left behind after cheese production, it developed a naturally acidic character during fermentation. That acidity helped prevent spoilage and allowed the drink to remain usable for long periods, making it especially valuable in remote regions where fuel, grain, and other resources were often limited. The same fermented whey also found another important purpose. It was used to preserve food for months at a time, allowing meat to remain edible throughout the long northern winters. Once again, the Vikings had discovered a practical solution without ever understanding the scientific processes behind it. Whether they were brewing beer, fermenting whey, or producing mead, the principle remained remarkably consistent. Experience guided every decision, and nowhere would that accumulated knowledge prove more valuable than far from land, where an entire crew depended upon whatever water they had managed to carry aboard their ship. For all the challenges the Vikings faced on land, none tested their knowledge of water more severely than life at sea. A settlement could dig a deeper well. Travelers could alter their route in search of a cleaner spring. Farmers could move their animals away from a polluted stream. But once a longship disappeared beyond the coastline, every decision made before departure suddenly became a matter of survival. The crew had only the supplies they carried with them. Fresh water was stored in large wooden barrels secured beneath the deck. At first glance, the solution seemed simple. Fill the barrels before sailing, ration the contents carefully, and replenish them whenever land was reached. In reality, the problem was far more complicated. Water stored for long periods gradually lost its freshness. Inside the wooden barrels, natural contamination slowly increased, eventually producing unpleasant odors and making the water increasingly unsafe to drink. The Vikings understood this long before they knew the reason. Generations of sailors had learned that not every liquid spoiled at the same rate. Fresh water was always consumed first, while it remained usable. Once those supplies began to deteriorate, the crew relied more heavily on weak beer and other fermented drinks that remained stable for much longer. In the harsh northern colonies, Blanda became an especially valuable reserve because its acidic nature allowed it to last through extended voyages with far less risk of spoilage. Careful planning became just as important as navigation itself. Rather than attempting impossibly long crossings without stopping, Viking sailors usually followed routes that offered regular opportunities to replenish their supplies. Voyages across the North Atlantic often passed through the Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland before continuing farther west. Each stop provided fresh water, food, and a chance to prepare for the next stage of the journey. Even the weather could become an ally. When rain arrived, large woolen sails were sometimes used to collect fresh water. The first runoff carrying accumulated salt and dirt was discarded. Once the water became clean, it was directed into empty barrels for storage. Sailors also gathered moisture from heavy fog and morning dew whenever conditions allowed. Every possible source of fresh water was treated as a valuable opportunity rather than taken for granted. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Viking expansion across the North Atlantic was never sustained by courage alone. Their remarkable voyages depended upon thousands of practical decisions made long before a ship ever left the harbor. They built dependable wells, protected water sources, learned the value of fermentation, refined methods of storing liquids, and carefully planned routes around reliable freshwater supplies. These quiet innovations rarely appear in legends, yet they made every famous expedition possible. History remembers the Vikings for their ships, their exploration, and their fearless reputation. But behind every successful voyage stood another achievement that receives far less attention. They mastered one of humanity's oldest challenges. In a world where clean drinking water could never be taken for granted, the Vikings learned not only how to find it, but how to protect it, preserve it, and carry it across some of the most dangerous seas on Earth.